Alright, so welcome. I wanted to put together a quick video around lubricants, specifically bicycle chain lubricants, sort of debunk a few myths, help point people in the right direction to trying to choose a good lubricant for their bicycle chain. So first off, what is a lubricant and what makes a good lubricant? So when you think about lubricants, oil is essentially the lubricant. It's used pretty much everywhere. The basis and the way that it works is that between two moving parts, there's a thin film of the oil between the parts so that when the parts move against each other, they're riding on that really, really thin little film and not touching each other and wearing together. So that's basically the way a lubricant works. There's many different lubricants for different purposes and different environments. So that's really, really important when you select a lubricant. You're trying to select it for the conditions that it will operate inside of. You look at something like an engine oil, it's there because there's additives which help remove combustion byproducts. It also transfers heat between components, and then you've got greases and all sorts of other lubricants as well. A guiding principle in terms of different additives, moly, PTFE, ceramic, you'll hear all these terms. A good guiding principle is to think, is this used in industry? If you can try and save a small percent in an industrial application, you are talking huge, huge gains. Lots of money, whether it be savings, more efficiency, or time between servicing. So if you see some fancy little words on something, is it used in industry, is normally a good test of whether or not it's useful to have in your application. Also, think about application. Is it something that is similar to a bicycle chain, or it's going to be completely different? So I'm going to go through a few different types of lubricants. You'll see things such as wet and dry lubricants. So a wet lubricant is for wet conditions. It's typically very, very thick, it's very tacky, and it sticks well to the chain. The downside of a wet lubricant is that it's going to attract dirt, and that dirt, the grit, will stick to that lubricant and potentially find its way inside your chain. At that point in time, it's basically grinding paste and will wear away the components. So that's a wet lubricant. It's there because it protects the chain in adverse weather conditions. If you look at something like a dry lubricant or a wax-based lubricant, it's the other opposite end. It typically is not a heavy, thick, sticky liquid, and dirt thus won't stick to it, or it sort of hits it and it falls off. The downside is that it can wash off in bad weather conditions, leaving nothing on your chain to do the actual lubrication work. So I've used pretty much all of these products and a few more. I'm going to talk to a few different applications and what I have found. So in terms of why me, why am I putting this video together? I've got a pretty good test bed. I commute 2 hours a day. It's 45 kilometers per day. And it's 1,100 meters or thereabouts of climbing, and I'm 92 kilos. So pretty heavy, do a heck of a lot of climbing, and it's the same route in all four conditions each and every day. So it's super consistent. It's a great sort of scientific test bed to try different lubricants over time and see how long they last. The end result and why I've been doing all of this is that my group set, my cassette, chain, and chain rings have been lasting 3,000 kilometers, and I have not been able to get anything more than 3,000 kilometers before the chain starts to skip over the cassette, which means it's stretched, it's worn, and I have to replace everything. The last setup that I used, different lubricant, I was able to get 4,000 kilometers. So they go from 3,000 to 4,000. That is a 30% increase. That is a huge, huge gain. So I'm going to show you and tell you what I actually did differently and why I think it's working well for me. So in terms of lubricants, engine oil, the old engine oil, huge amounts of it, ultra cheap. Used it a little bit, quite good, quite clean in the application. It's going to have a lot of additives which are there to remove combustion byproducts and deal with things that are not necessarily in a bicycle chain application. Heard that it works well and got some pretty good success out of it. Stayed clean enough, was good in wet weather as well. I'm going to cover this in a little bit more depth. Automatic transmission fluid. So purely there to stop wear between components, gears. Great application, quite similar to a bicycle chain. The difference is a gearbox is encased. And that's the difference between a bicycle chain and pretty much everything else you see. A bicycle chain, the gears, is a horribly designed system because it's exposed. All the grit, all the contaminants, be they soil, dust, sand, be it water, can get inside the moving parts. So these guys have to do a super, super tough job in trying to cope with that. So we're going to go to greases. So a grease is basically an oil that is being held in place with some other additives. So the job there is to make sure that the oil sticks in place. It's doing its job. It doesn't get washed away by solvents or liquids or anything else. Also helps the oil to stay there in different temperature ranges. So grease is awesome. It's a great way to lubricate something. The downside is that you can't get grease into the chain. It's made with grease. You'll see when you get a new chain, it's put together with grease. It's nice and tacky. However, you can't get any grease back into those fine little areas. Otherwise, it would be perfect. If we look at the simple oil-based lubricants, you've got something like Pedro's Road Rage. Use this on the road bike, which I only ride in good weather conditions. Lasts well, nice and light, doesn't attract the dirt too much, but if it was adverse weather, you'd have to do a bit of cleaning around that. Something a little bit heavier would be your Park Tools lubricant. Again, a pretty simple stock hydrocarbon, oil-based, a little bit thicker, better in worse adverse conditions with weather. Has your little PTFE, some friction modifiers, which I'll go into a little bit later as well. Then you go all the way up to a wet lubricant. So this is super, super thick, super tacky. And that's how it stays on your chain through all the stormy wet weather conditions. The downside is that dirt and grit will stick to it. So if it sticks to it, it can find its way into the chain and then it becomes a bit of a grinding paste. So sticks in bad weather, you will have to do some more maintenance and cleaning. But otherwise, I use this on my single speed bikes. It's great. So we go to the other end, the sort of fancier end of the spectrum, look at something like a rock and roll. So what you notice here is that there's some separation. You've got some sediment down the bottom and a fluid up the top. So what this basically is that's the lubricant. That's the stuff that's going to provide the lubricating properties, and then you've got a carrier fluid. That serves two purposes. That will do the cleaning of the chain and flushes out all the grit, all the dirt, all the contaminants, and deposits the lubricating stuff inside the chain in those little hard to reach places. This will help work itself in there. The carrier fluid then evaporates, leaving behind the lubricant. So the good thing is that it simplifies maintenance. You squirt it on, move it around, it cleans, lubes, no worries. You're paying a lot of money for what is basically essentially kerosene or something like that. So good for maintenance, a little bit pricey for the amount of actual lubricant you get depending, but saves you a lot of time. So you simply give that the old shake and apply that, spin it round, and job's basically done. If you look at something like a wax lube, which I don't have here, I used a wax lube once, went on a ride, did about 200 meters of climbing, there was no lubricant left in my chain. You could hear that the parts were moving, working, wearing together, so I would never recommend a wax lubricant in any condition. Oil is lubricant because it can flow back in and creates that film. If you use a hard-based wax lubricant, it gets displaced, then there's nothing. It's not going to flow back in between the parts and there's not going to be anything between them. So highly recommend against wax-based lubricants. You've got a dry lubricant. I use this about twice. The slightest bit of rain and there is nothing on your chain. So if it's super, super dry, maybe, but one patch of rain, it depends how far you are from home, you're going to be wearing out your chain quite fast. It's got some fancy ceramic stuff. Again, I'll talk to that. Wouldn't recommend. I'd choose a lighter oil over something like that any day. At the very far end of the cost spectrum is something like Demontech. Used this for a while, got 3,000 Ks out of it like I did anything else. Found this to get a little bit gunky. The principles behind this is that it's basically some polymers, Teflon-esque type substances, and as the parts move and wear, they deposit these little bits of low friction plastics, and that's what is wearing, or that's what your chain moves on. It's not metal to metal, it's metal on those polymers. Cost a lot of money, but the difference is essentially what you're paying for is 100% lubricant. If you compare it to something like rock and roll, it does cost you a lot more, but there's no carrier fluid, it doesn't need it. So you've got to clean your chain and apply, and you're not paying a heck of a lot of money for this. So it may seem expensive, but you're getting that in an entire bottle. Would I recommend it? Not really. For the money, there's better things to be had. I have used it. It wasn't anything terribly special. So what did I end up with? How did I get those 4,000 kilometers? Pretty simply put, I switched to this. Automatic transmission fluid, nothing fancy. Use that, it gave me the best wear. The reason for that is it's super light, it's super thin, it's not sticky, so it's not attracting the dirt. However, I do need to reapply that about 3 times every fortnight. So I have to apply it a little bit more frequently. I'm happy to do the maintenance work. It's super thin, it does the lubricant, it is a great lubricant. The guys that are doing these oils, these applications, that's their job. They spend unknown millions of dollars looking at different compounds to get better wear, to get longer lasting performance. So these guys aren't doing anything terribly fancy that things like automotive manufacturers and oil manufacturers aren't already doing. So look to the industrial applications, and as I said, the automatic transmission fluid, 30% better wear. The other thing I did notice is that when the chain wore, it wasn't stretch, it wasn't jumping over. It was basically worn side plates. So when I changed gears, I had to change a couple of gears just to try and get one to actually move across because the plates were so worn and it wasn't the actual stretch. So in terms of friction modifiers, so you'll see things like moly, things like Teflon, PTFE, things like ceramic, which is typically hexagonal boron nitride. Get it off eBay, online, $50 for 10 lifetimes worth of powder. So these are substances that are super slippery. Something like Teflon, the way Teflon works is when you've got 2 parts wearing, it'll actually deposit Teflon on the 2 surfaces. So you then have Teflon sliding against Teflon. That's the basis to which they work, and it is a super low friction compound. Moly disulfide, the same sort of thing. One interesting application of moly is in firearm projectiles. So they'll actually tumble the projectiles in a tumbler with some powder, and that deposits, these little balls deposit the powder onto the projectiles. You're talking application that is very high temperature, very high pressure, and keeps the barrels cleaner when they're using it. They've since switched to HBN, the boron nitride powder. It's a better powder, doesn't attract humidity like the moly, and again, ultra high pressure, ultra high temperature. So the ceramic powder is a good little thing to have in your back pocket. So the other things I did try, I made up a nice little formula here. One thing, so I use these for vaping, so they're oil resistant and have a really nice little metal tip on the top of them, great for putting small amounts of lubricant on a chain. So this is the moly grease with the automatic transmission fluid. Those two do not mix very well at all. So you basically have to heat the grease up, do it in a water bath, don't use flame, it's a hydrocarbon, it can catch fire. You heat the grease up, which makes it more viscous and a little bit more liquid. You then start to mix in that transmission fluid. So this is the grease, which has the moly in it and thickens up the transmission fluid a little bit. Used this, loved it, had better wet weather protection. Again, you're talking about $10 for a tub. I don't remember how much the transmission fluid cost, but it's probably the equivalent of a bottle of that. So for $20, you and your mates can have a lifetime supply of some really good lubricant. The other latest mixture that I've got is this one here. So this is using the transmission fluid with the boron nitride powder and also a little bit of silicon lubricants. So silicon lubricants are great to displace water and give it a little bit more wet weather characteristic. So you mix the oil in with the grease to have a slightly thinner grease. Then you can start adding in the transmission fluid and then put a little sprinkle of powder at the end, and you end up with this. You give it a little bit of a shake, and apply. So it has the silicone in there, gives it a bit better wet weather protection, has the friction modifying powder in there, has the great lubricant, which is the automatic transmission fluid, and is a little bit thicker from the grease, so again stays there a little bit better in the wet weather as well. So highly recommend, give it a go. People have found great application of engine oil. I highly recommend transmission fluid. It has worked sensationally with myself. And yeah, try out a few little different things, adding a bit of grease. You can't really go too wrong with a great solid lubricant. So hopefully that's helped a few people, debunk a few myths. Again, look at the application. If you see people posting on a forum saying, hey, what lubricant do I use? Hey, use this, this is the best stuff. Do not take that advice. You need to look at your application. Do you ride in the wet? Is it going to be dry? Do you want absolute minimal maintenance in terms of time? That's going to steer you towards a wet lubricant, a thinner lubricant, maybe something that has a cleaning fluid inside of it to cut down on the maintenance. Have a look at all the different properties and advantages of the different lubricants. They are for different applications. So hopefully that's helped a few people. Best of luck out there in your search for an ultra long lasting, clean, good lubricant. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to actually have a look at the chain that I got the 4,000 kilometers out of to see where the wear and tear actually is. So this is a Connex made by Whipperman. So actually just going to have a look at the chain components to see where we can see the wear. The interesting thing about this is it wasn't the stretch that made me throw away the chain, it was actually the play from side to side. So when I was changing gears, I had to take 2 gears and back it off a gear to actually change the cog. It was so worn left and right that I had to throw it out. So here we can see the outer plate. You can see the name there, little Connex name on the actual outer plate there. Nothing too exciting. You can see in the middle there a bit of whatevers. So let's go to the other side of the outer plate. And you can see the amount of wear, so see those markings, see how you can see it's just been rubbing and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing all around this particular outer plate. And you can see the edge there between the two. There's quite a bit of a gap. There's actually been a heck of a lot of wear that's actually occurred on that plate. We can go to the other end of it. And again, you can really see that has just been gouged out, thousands and thousands of RPMs. The grit that is gotten in there in the lubricant has just worn it away like grinding paste. So that's the outer plate. Let's have a look at some of the inner plates now. So again, here's the inner plate, and you can see that again you've got all that wear and tear, the grinding just slowly polishing. You've got again quite a little bit of a lip on the side there where it's just purely been worn away like there's no tomorrow. If we flip around and have a look at the other side of one of those little inner plates, you can see it there. So quite a bit of mashing there as you're going over the cogs. Fair bit of pitting. And again, you can see that where you look at the gap there, you look at how that's just been gouged out over time. We look at the connecting pins here. So quite interesting. Again, have a good look at that. You can just see just thousands of RPMs. You've got the grit, you've got in there just polishing, wearing. So this is no issues as to guessing why this was so faulty. It just simply was worn away. Going to have a quick look at the pins now. So interesting to see that the pins are in relatively good shape. As I said, I didn't get that sort of stretching movement that was causing grief. Oh, that's gone. I'll get that little fella back. So you can see here, you can see where it's all nice and shiny. You've got the surfaces that have been rubbed on time after time after time. But again, if you can have a look at the top edge of it there, it's not as though it's really lost a lot of thickness in any particular place. We'll go to this little one here, and you can see, well, that's sitting on the inner plates. You can see the wear patches quite clearly there. And we go to the third pin, And again, you can see where that's just been polished off from thousands and thousands of RPMs over time. Again, the pins aren't in super bad condition. I'm actually pretty happy with the way that they look. This particular chain was quite an expensive chain. It's got stainless steel pins in it, so I'm pretty impressed that they worked well. What clearly did not wear too well was the plates, but again, you're throwing basically grinding paste in there, so no surprises as to why they weren't functioning after so long. So that's a quick look inside of a chain. Again, I've got an extra 1,000 kilometers, 30% out of this chain. So it's looking pretty average inside because it's basically just been ground away. So yeah, that's an interesting little look at what a chain looks like under a microscope.